Hello, I'm Dr. Tom Macaulay from the University of Sheffield in the UK, and I work on Japanese medieval poetry and poetic criticism. Well, the poetry contest is a mixed occasion, an event which is for the competition or the composition and presentation of poetry, its criticism, and for forming the views of what appropriate poetic style and poetics should be. To call them poetry contests is something of a misnomer, as the aristocracy of pre-modern Japan were fond of all different kinds of matching activities. So they loved to compare and contrast incense and paintings and shells and flowers and so forth. And sometimes poetry was a part of this and sometimes it wasn't. And sometimes poetry became the main thing which was actually matched and compared and then judged. So gradually the poetry competition, which first got started in the 880s at the very earliest stages, and at that point was mainly a social occasion for aristocrats to get together and admire each other's clothes and show off their wealth and make nice comments about how beautifully the ladies were dressed and so forth, morphed into more and more of a literary occasion where well-known poets would actually present their work and be formally judged and assessed by members of the aristocracy who were known as poets and were trusted to provide critical and appropriate judgments, or sometimes just amusing judgments, so that the assembled company could enjoy the conflict and disagreement between the different views of poetics which were expressed. The process of the poetry competition was that the teams who were participating were divided into the teams of the left and teams of the right. And generally what would happen would be that a poet from the team of the left would present his poem, and the poet from the team of the right would present his poem. And then the left would comment on the right's poem, the right would comment on the left's poem, and then a judge would provide their opinion about both poems together and assign either a win to one or other poem or a tie for the round. And ties could be assigned either because poems were both too good to be one to be judged the loser, or both so poor that neither deserved a win. Competitions will be judged by men of acknowledged poetic experience and authority. As they became more literary competitions, they were still more sort of social occasions, then they might very well be judged by the sponsor of the competition or an aristocrat of senior status who could therefore put the weight of their authority behind the approval of the different poems. Poetry was absolutely crucial to the way in which society functioned in pre-modern Japan. It was something that everyone did constantly. It was how you expressed your feelings about the beautiful scene, or your feelings of sorrow that someone's friend had passed away, or that someone had got married, or someone had a child, and so forth. So it was an integral part of life. And because it was so much an integral part of life and was valued by people of senior status, and particularly the imperial family and the emperors themselves, then being good at poetry essentially came to mean being good at the business of being an aristocrat. And so having one's poetry acknowledged and approved by one's social superiors or by one's equals was a way of gathering social and then sometimes even political status in the society of the time. If you were a junior poet, then while you might not be able to compete directly with people from the various highest echelons of society, you might get asked by a senior aristocrat to compose a poem on his behalf, and then it would be presented, but everyone would know, of course, that it was your work, and that could lead to other requests for poems to be composed for particular occasions, and so bring tangible economic rewards to junior poets. If you did get to be invited to take part in competitions where senior people were present. It was an occasion to get to know the people who were right at the top of society, and therefore make contacts, network, and other social, cultural, political, economic benefits could flow from that. So it was an absolutely crucial activity for people invited to participate in them. So poetry was frequently written down and recorded, both for official and unofficial and personal and private and public purposes as well. So there are literally thousands, tens of thousands of poems recorded, written down in various different types of collections. You had the most formal and public collections, the imperially sponsored poetry anthologies, which would have been copied and circulated widely. But almost anyone who was anyone would try their hand at personal anthologizing, putting together their own favorite collections of poems, which would be written down and passed around members of their family. Or if they were well-known poets, then they would compile their own poems together into collections which then could be passed on to members of their families, friends, social superiors as well, and given as gifts. So with all of this record keeping, there's an awful lot of documentary evidence of what these poems were. Well, I've worked on a poetry competition called the Ropyakaban Utawase, the poetry contest in 600 rounds. This is a really crucial contest for a whole range of reasons. First of all, it's one of the two largest contests which we have in complete form remaining. So it's important simply by virtue of its size. It's also important in that it was judged by a poet by the name of Fujiwara no Shunzei. Now, Shunzei has been called probably the most accomplished critic in Japanese literary history, and therefore his views of poetry and poetics were extremely influential for centuries after his death, and some of the ways in which he judged poetry, the Ropyakaban Utawase, have been shown to be influential on subsequent poetry competition judgments too. Ropyakaban Utawase also took place at perhaps the pinnacle of court poetry, in the sense that it was a period when we were beginning to see the development of factionalism and different poetic houses amongst the aristocrats in Kyoto. And not long after this competition actually took place, diverging views on poetry became so extensive that it was impossible for people from different poetic houses to even talk to each other about poetry. But at this point, then we can see the differences in views in the way in which poetry ought to be composed, the themes and the ways in which were appropriate there. And we have Shunzei as a figure of acknowledged authority, perhaps the last remaining figure of total authority, which everyone respected. Ropyakaban Utawase is what's known as a hyakushu utawase, in that the poets taking part were each presented with a list of 100 topics and asked to compose 100 poems on those 100 topics. 50 of the topics were on seasonal subjects, and 50 were on love. Many of the topics were extremely well trodden and very well known before. Others were completely novel and completely new, and so posed additional challenges for poets to actually work with them, because they had no precedent as to know how that should actually work. The poets themselves who took part, there were 12 of them, came from essentially three separate groups. There were a number of young men from the very pinnacle of the court hierarchy, including the competition's sponsor, Fujiwara no Yoshitsune. And then there were representatives of two separate poetic traditions. Very crudely, poetic conservatives and poetic modernizers. And one of Yoshitsune's main motivations for holding the competition, I think, was to show off the differences in approach between these two groups of poets with very different views about how poetry should be composed, what topics and what language were appropriate, as a way of creating a creative crucible for the further development of waka at that time. Well, there were, by the time of Rokbakawa no Utawase, there were a number of key sort of critical criteria which were established for Utawase poems. They had to address the topic correctly. And so different topics had different ideas about which emotional connotations should be appropriate for using them, which language should be appropriate for using them, and so forth. So Shunzei and other poets will criticize the use of individual pieces of diction if they feel that it doesn't reflect the correct emotional tone or the correct message which is put across by key topics. Poetry had to be able to be understood when heard as opposed to when read, as poetry was formally recited rather than being read as a primary activity. So there are comments made on how easy it is actually to understand particular poems, how they sound, what their phonology is like, whether they're euphonic or not, whether they're harmonious when they sound. Another key issue is that they had to be appropriately formal. The Japanese term for that is hare. Now, that meant that they had to avoid excessive displays of emotion. They shouldn't be excessively personal. One of the comments which is sometimes made is that some of the poems is that they too much resemble laments over personal circumstances or appeals for promotion and things, and that's criticized as being too personal. But equally, they had to reflect the world as it actually was, the world as poetry understood it. So you couldn't talk about, for example, deer. If you raise the topic of deer in a poem, they had to be sad. It had to be in reference to autumn. If you hear deer calling from the forest, then the deer is lamenting the fact that it hasn't got a mate and so forth. So if you referenced a deer in any other kind of context in a poem, then your poem wouldn't work because it was a poor poem. So an understanding of the appropriate depiction of poetic reality was a key feature as well. And so these are all the kinds of things which Shunzei comments on extensively. There's also the question of appropriate uses of intertextuality, what types of poems or sources could be referred to as or mentioned as inspiration or to add additional connotations to the poetry which was composed. The reason I decided to translate it is, well, to be purely personal about it, it was a labor of love. It was something that I really wanted to do because I liked the poetry. And after reading the original judgments and the ways in which the views were expressed, enjoyed that too. But I think there's an immense amount of material and available in there for future scholars or current scholars of Waka. We of course have 1,200 poems which have been composed in different ways and which can be analysed for themselves. We have the extensive judgments by Shunzei expressing how he felt the different poems' strengths and weaknesses actually worked. So we have views of aesthetics, we have views of criticism, we have views of poetry itself. We have the comments by the participants too, of course, to add that in and to demonstrate the way in which criticism as an activity in Utawase was very often a collaborative process of different critics proposing different ideas and then views emerging from this. As you can hear from my accent, I'm English, I'm British, and so I suspect they come out sounding rather British in the translation. We'll see what people think of that as that voice for them. Obviously, they were not British; they came from Japan. But I hope that I have put their words into their original Japanese words into a form which reflects the tone, the style, and the spirit of how they were writing and how they expressed themselves.
風にすゆこぼれきぬこひそめし心はいつぞいその神みやこの奥の裕福